Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. In this session, we shall discuss the preparation strategy for international relations. International relations is a very interesting and vast subject which covers the entire spectrum of India's foreign policy. But most aspirants face a couple of challenges while preparing for this subject. The first challenge is what to study and what not to study. This is a very important question because if you invest too much time into this subject, it may not fetch adequate returns in the examination. And moreover, IR is a minor component of your prelims paper. The second challenge is with regard to sources and the material that is needed for the sake of reference. So let us simplify and answer all these questions, which will help you to draw up a preparation strategy. IR as a subject is relevant for both prelims and as well as for mains. And just like any other UPSC subject, it has a static part and a dynamic part. The static part will help you to understand a few core concepts and the background to some important topics. But it is the dynamic part which should really be the focus of your preparation. Because most IR questions in prelims and mains are based entirely on current developments in global geopolitics. So let us make use of the syllabus that has been prescribed by UPSC and let us look at some of the questions which have appeared in the previous question papers in order to identify the key topics which should be the focus of your preparation. First, we shall talk about the strategy for prelims and then we shall look at the strategy for mains. If you analyze the previous question papers, you can establish the trend for IR questions that have appeared in prelims. But if you look at this graph, you can see that there is no consistency in the number of questions that have appeared in prelims from international relations. In 2013, there was no question which was directly related to international relations. Then in 2014, we had around 4 questions. This increased substantially in 2015 and 2016 when we got around 8 and 11 questions respectively. This again dropped to around 4 questions in 2017 and 2019, and in between we had around 9 questions in 2018. So we can say that on an average we can expect around 5 to 10 questions from international relations in prelims. This is still quite substantial because it constitutes around 5 to 10% of your prelims question paper. Now when you look at the prelims syllabus, you will find that international relations has not been explicitly mentioned. But since the subject is driven by current affairs, it is an integral part of current events of national and international importance. And since IR is a multidisciplinary subject, it is closely related to world geography and as well as global developments in the field of sustainable development, technology, environment and climate change, etc. So you can expect a few IR related questions in these topics as well. Since there is no definitive syllabus for international relations in prelims, we need to make use of previous questions in order to identify some of the key topics. Based on this assessment, we can identify that these are the topics from which most of the prelims questions have come from. You need to focus on international organizations, indices and reports, map-based questions, developments involving India's interests, and few questions fall under the miscellaneous category because they cannot be classified under any of the above topics. So let us take up these topics one by one and look at a few sample questions, and then we can discuss the strategy to cover these topics in the best way possible. Let us start with international organizations. Most of the questions in prelims have come from this topic. For example, in 2016, we had a question on the Gulf Cooperation Council. These organizations are picked up by UPSC because they were in news during that period. The Gulf Cooperation Council was in news because of its involvement in some of the conflicts in the Middle East region. Later, there were some internal differences amongst the Gulf countries and they were trying to isolate Qatar for its role in destabilizing the region. And India as well was pursuing very close relations with the Gulf Cooperation Council in order to secure some of its national interests, such as energy security, well-being of the Indian diaspora in the Middle East, etc. So these were some of the current developments which made the UPSC ask a static question on the Gulf Cooperation Council. So you need to identify such organizations which are in news and see if there is any relevance for India, and then you should do some basic online research about such organizations and you should start maintaining notes on them. If there are any updates in the future, you can always add them to your existing notes on the organization, and this will help you to comprehensively cover all these topics and stay up to date with the recent developments. So in order to further simplify this topic, you can break it down into these 4 subtopics. You can start by reading about United Nations and its related organizations. Take up the United Nations organization, read about its principal organs such as the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, International Court of Justice, etc. Then proceed to read about the specialized agencies and programs of the United Nations. For example, you can take up UNESCO, UNDP, UN Environment Program, etc. This is just a short list that I am providing over here, but you can comprehensively cover all the UN related organizations so that you will be able to answer any prelims based question. Next, you can do the same for regional organizations or regional groupings as well. First, start with those regional organizations of which India is a member of. For example, you can start with SAARC, BIMSTEC, BRICS, etc. Then read about organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because India has recently become a member of the SCO. So once you cover all these regional groupings of which India is a part of, then you can proceed to take up other regional organizations where India is not directly involved. For example, we have ASEAN, European Union, African Union, etc. Then you can take up multilateral and global organizations such as the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, IMF, etc. You should read about the structure and mandate of these organizations. You should also read about the initiatives, the programs that have been taken up under these global institutions. And finally, you should cover India's relations with these respective organizations. And finally, you should take up few treaties and conventions which are currently in news. For example, we have the Refugee Convention, which is constantly in news because of the Rohingya crisis. Then we have the Budapest Convention, which deals with cybersecurity. So you need to watch out for such treaties and international conventions which are in news, and you should start making notes about them. So this approach should be more than sufficient to comprehensively cover all the relevant international organizations. The next topic would be indices and reports. Every year, international organizations publish reports and indices, and this is again a favorite topic for UPSC. For example, in the 2019 prelims paper, we had a question on the Ease of Doing Business Index, which is published by the World Bank. And similarly, we had a question on the Global Competitiveness Report, which is published by the World Economic Forum. So while reading newspapers, you need to watch out for the reports and indices that are published by various international organizations. You should start making a list and identify some of the key parameters which are used in developing that index. For example, when you look at the Ease of Doing Business Index that is published by the World Bank, there are few key parameters which are used to develop the index. So please read about those parameters and then identify India's ranking or India's performance in those indices and reports. So these are the kind of areas that a prelims question would focus on. The next category would be map-based questions. This is where developments in international relations can trigger a question on world geography. For example, in 2015, we had a question on few countries which are located in Southwest Asia and its connection to the Mediterranean Sea. Similarly, in 2018, we had a question on high levels of malnutrition, which is prevalent in a few countries, which is a direct outcome of war and ethnic conflicts. So as you can see, based on global geopolitical developments, map-based questions can be asked in prelims. So the best way to prepare for this topic would be to regularly identify some of the places and regions which are in news. When you're reading newspapers, you need to look out for some important locations, countries and cities which are constantly being reported. And you should make use of an atlas to look out for any unique geographical features of that particular region. You need to identify the countries that share a border with that region. You should also identify the seas and the oceans that are present around it. And you should look out for important geographical features such as straits, gulf, bays, mountain ranges, rivers, strategic ports, etc. So let us take an example in order to understand how a map should be read. Here we are looking at the map of the Persian Gulf and the Middle East region. This has been taken in the context of the ongoing tensions between US and Iran. So when you look at the map of the Persian Gulf, you can identify important geographical features such as the Strait of Hormuz, which is a strategic choke point. You can identify the Gulf of Oman. You can also identify the countries which open towards the Persian Gulf. This includes Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Oman, etc. You should also note that Bahrain is an island country which is located in the Persian Gulf. You should also identify strategic ports such as Bandar Abbas and the Chabahar port, which is located in Iran. So based on such geographical features, a map-based question can be asked on regions and places which are in news. The next topic would be developments involving India's interests. This could include India's participation in a summit or in a treaty. It could include global developments in technology, international law, etc. It could also include deals and agreements that are signed by other countries which can have an impact on India's national interests. For example, in the 2016 prelims paper, we had a question on the India-Africa summit. This question was asked because India had recently hosted a summit with the African Union and India was pursuing closer relations with the African countries. Similarly, in the 2019 paper, we had a question on the General Data Protection Regulation, which was adopted by the European Union in 2016 and implemented from 2018 onwards. So these are the kind of developments which can have an impact on India's national interests, and you need to watch out for them when you're reading newspapers. So when you're preparing for current affairs, look out for treaties and summits which involve India or which can affect India's interests. Look out for defense deals, economic agreements, etc. Also watch out for developments in technology and international law. For example, the ongoing development with regard to the introduction of 5G technology has geopolitical ramifications. So this is something that you need to cover as a part of your current affairs. And finally, there will be a few questions which cannot be categorized under any of the previous topics. So they belong to the miscellaneous category. For example, in the 2016 paper, we had a question on the ethnic groups which are frequently in news. The question was related to Kurds, Madhesis and Rohingyas who are frequently in news as far as global geopolitics is concerned. So there was a question based on this topic, and in the same paper, we had a question on Doctors Without Borders, which is an international NGO that is providing medical assistance in conflict zones such as Syria, Yemen, Libya, etc. So these are the kind of questions which fall under the miscellaneous category, and the best way to prepare for them is by reading the international page in newspapers. Now let us talk about the strategy for mains. International relations is a part of your syllabus under GS paper 2. So if you analyze the previous question papers, you can understand the allocation of marks for IR questions. In the 2013 paper, IR questions accounted for around 70 marks. Then in 2014, it was around 62.5 marks. And since then, it has consistently stayed at 50 marks. So out of 250 marks in GS paper 2, IR questions alone account for around 20 to 28% of the question paper. So with this understanding, let us look at the main syllabus that has been prescribed by UPSC. Unlike the prelim syllabus, the main syllabus for IR is well defined and there are 5 chapters under GS paper 2. The first chapter deals with India's relations with its neighboring countries. The second chapter deals with India's bilateral relations with some of the major powers of the world. It also covers regional groupings and global groupings and India's involvement with these organizations. And the third chapter deals with the impact of the policies of other countries on India's national interests. The fourth chapter deals with the contribution of the Indian diaspora and the well-being of the Indian diaspora. Then we have the fifth chapter, which deals with international institutions and their structure and mandate. So let us take up these topics one by one and analyze them by taking previous questions. Now let's take up the first topic, that is India's relations with its neighboring countries. Most IR questions in mains, they are based on current developments. But to answer these questions, you need a good mix of static knowledge and current affairs. For example, in the 2017 paper, we had a question on China's economic policies and its impact on India. So this is not just a factual question, but it is an analytical question. In order to answer this question, you need static knowledge of India's economic relations with China, and you should also be aware of current developments, which shows that China is using its economic strength or its economic might to project its military power. So only when you're thorough with the static and dynamic component of India's relations with China, only then you can develop the analysis which is required to answer this question. Similarly, in 2013, we had a question on the Shahbag Square protests in Bangladesh and the threat of rising Islamic fundamentalism on India's national security. This again requires a combination of static and dynamic knowledge. And in the same paper, we had a question on political instability in Maldives and its impact on India. And we also had a question on India's relations with Sri Lanka and how does domestic factors in Tamil Nadu influence India's foreign policy towards Sri Lanka. So as you can see, questions on India's neighboring countries can be very specific. They will not just ask India's relations with a particular country, but they can pick up a specific issue of concern and they will ask you to develop a critical analysis and provide your opinions on that topic. So in order to prepare for this chapter, you need to identify the 8 neighboring countries of India in South Asia. This includes China, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Maldives, Pakistan, Myanmar, Afghanistan and Bhutan. For the static part, you should read about India's historical relations with its neighboring countries from any standard textbook. First, you can read about the ancient and civilizational connections that India has with its neighboring countries. And then you should focus on India's relations with its neighboring countries since 1947. Once you have covered the static part, you should maintain separate notes for each neighboring country and then you can pick up specific contemporary issues. For example, if you are reading about India and Pakistan, you should focus on the Kashmir conflict. You should read about cross-border terrorism that emanates from Pakistan and how it affects India. Similarly, when you're reading about India and China, you should be thorough about the recent border disputes. You should read about the Belt and Road Initiative, the String of Pearls theory, the South China Sea conflict, and you should also cover the ongoing strategic conflict between India and China in the Indo-Pacific region. So like this, you can pick up each contemporary issue separately and add those notes to the static part. This will help you to comprehensively cover India's relations with its neighboring countries. And you should also remember that this is one of the most important chapters because any developments in our neighborhood will have an immediate impact on India's national interests. So that's the reason why UPSC gives special attention to India's relations with its neighboring countries. And while preparing, you need to go a little in depth and cover both historical relations and as well as contemporary issues. The next topic would be India's relations with non-neighbors. Under this chapter, you have to cover India's bilateral relations with some of the major powers of the world. Under this topic, you need not focus on the historical relations between India and these countries. You only need to pick up the contemporary issues which are currently in news. See, for example, in 2018, we had a question on India's relations with Israel. In 2013, we had a question on India's relations with Japan. And in 2016, there was a question on India's Look East policy in the post-Cold War era. Except for the third question, most of the other questions are based on current affairs. So there is no need to focus much on India's historical relations with non-neighbors, because most questions from this topic will be based on current developments. Under the same chapter, we also have regional groupings. In 2016, we had a question on SAARC. In 2015, there was a question related to the African Union. So let us see as to how we can prepare for India's bilateral relations with some of the major powers of the world, and as well as India's relations with some of the important regional groupings. When you're dealing with India's bilateral ties with non-neighboring countries, it is always best to start out with the P5 countries. The P5 stands for the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. This includes United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. Obviously, you would have already covered China under India's neighboring countries, so you can cover the remaining 4 countries of the P5 because India's relations with these countries is of utmost strategic importance. Once you're done with the P5 countries, you can focus on some of the important regions of the world. For example, you can start with Southeast Asia. In the Southeast Asian region, India implements a dedicated policy known as the Look East Act East policy. This will help you understand the broad framework of India's policy towards the Southeast Asian countries. Once you're done with that, you can pick a few important countries from the Southeast Asian region. For example, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, etc. So you can use the same approach for the Indo-Pacific region, West Asia, Central Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Latin American region. So there is no need to cover all the countries which are located in these regions. Instead, you need to pick out a few important countries in that particular year, depending on the priority that India has given in its foreign policy. So you need to look out for those countries which have been visited by the Indian Prime Minister and the Indian President. Similarly, you can watch out for incoming visits by foreign leaders. You should also monitor some of the joint projects or joint initiatives that India has taken up with few countries. So only a few countries will be important for this topic, and this will be determined by the current developments of that particular year. Then you can move on to regional groupings. Always start with those regional groupings of which India is a part of. You can start with SAARC, BIMSTEC, BRICS, IORA, etc. Focus on groupings such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which India has recently become a member. Once you cover these groups, then you can proceed to other regional groupings where India is not directly involved. For example, ASEAN, European Union, African Union, Gulf Cooperation Council, etc. Also pay special attention to those regional groupings with which India has signed a free trade agreement or with which India is in the process of negotiating a free trade agreement. Now moving on to the next chapter, you should focus on the policies of other countries which can have an impact on India's national interests. For example, in the 2018 paper, there was a question on the ongoing tensions between US and Iran and its impact on India. As you can see, India is not directly involved in the conflict between US and Iran. But still, tensions between these countries and their policies are affecting India's national interests. Because these tensions are affecting India's energy security. It is affecting India's relations with Iran. It is affecting India's connectivity with Afghanistan and Central Asia. So such policies of other countries which can affect India's national interests will also become very important for mains examination. The next chapter deals with the contribution and well-being of the Indian diaspora. So we had a question in 2017 which dealt with the contribution of the Indian diaspora to the Southeast Asian countries. See, the Indian diaspora is very well spread out across the world. They are present in a number of countries and they represent a very strong community. So in most of these countries, the Indian diaspora plays a major role and they contribute to the economy and the society of those countries. So this is one aspect that you need to pick up from current affairs and static knowledge. Then you should also understand the contribution of the Indian diaspora to the government of India in projecting India's soft power. For example, the Indian diaspora in the United States played a very important role in the negotiation of the Indo-US nuclear deal. So such topics can be very important for your exams. Next, you should focus on the concerns of the Indian diaspora as well, because policies of foreign governments can have a negative impact on the well-being of the Indian diaspora. For example, the visa policy of the United States. This can have a negative influence on the well-being of the Indian diaspora in the United States. So it becomes the responsibility of the Indian government to protect the interests of the Indian diaspora. Then you should also read about the threats being faced by the Indian diaspora, because the Indian diaspora is found in a number of conflict zones as well. For example, countries such as Yemen, Libya, etc. So conflicts in these countries directly threatens the lives of the Indian diaspora, and again, the Indian government is bound to protect them. And finally, you should also read about the welfare programs and welfare schemes that have been initiated by the Indian government for the sake of the Indian diaspora. So this will cover all the aspects related to the Indian diaspora. And the last chapter for mains is on international organizations. In 2015, we had a question on the UN Security Council. It was focused on India's efforts at introducing reforms at the United Nations. Then in 2017, we had a question on the United Nations Economic and Social Council. This was largely focused on the structure and the mandate of the institution. Next, in 2014, we had a question on the Information Technology Agreement, which is under the World Trade Organization, and its impact on India. So questions from this topic can be of two kinds. One, the question can be entirely focused on the static part, which will cover the structure and the mandate of the given institution. And second, it could be focused on some of the recent developments at these international organizations, which could have an impact on India's national interests. So in order to prepare for this chapter, you need to identify some of the major international organizations. For example, we have World Bank, World Trade Organization, UNICEF, the International Court of Justice, World Health Organization, UNESCO, the International Labour Organization, etc. So first and foremost, you need to cover the static part. You should focus on the structure and the mandate of these institutions. And the best source of information for the structure and mandate of these institutions would be Wikipedia and as well as the official websites of these international organizations. Once you cover the static part, identify India's equation with these international organizations. Look at the standing issues that India has with these international organizations. For example, at the WTO, you need to understand the conflict between the developed countries and the developing countries. The same applies for environment-related organizations as well. And with regard to World Bank, IMF and United Nations, you need to understand how the Western countries have dominated these institutions and how the developing countries are pushing for reforms at these institutions. Then finally, you need to make a list of static topics which will cover the major geopolitical developments since 1945. For example, you need to read about decolonization and India's role in assisting the decolonization efforts of other countries. You should read about the non-aligned movement which was pioneered by India during the Cold War. You should read about the Panchsheel Agreement between India and China and the 5 principles which govern the Panchsheel Agreement. You should also read about the Gujarat Doctrine. You should cover all the major conflicts that India has fought with Pakistan and China. You should read about the origins and the evolution of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. You should understand the impact of the Cold War on India's national interests. You should be aware of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which brought the Cold War to an end. You should read about the financial crisis that India went through in the early 1990s and how the LPG reforms of 1991 has transformed the Indian economy into one of the major economies of the world. Then also read about India's nuclear weapons program and the nuclear tests that India has carried out. You should also be aware of India's nuclear doctrine. And finally, read about the impact of the 9/11 attacks and how global terrorism has evolved post 2001. So you can prepare a list of such static topics and cover them through any standard textbook. So before we talk about the sources for international relations, please remember that IR as a subject is related to many other subjects as well. So IR related questions can appear under Indian economy in GS paper 3. They can appear under internal security under GS paper 3 as well. So when such questions appear in a different paper, your answer writing also has to adapt accordingly. Say for example, you have a question on Brexit under GS paper 2. If the question on Brexit is under international relations itself, then obviously you will cover various dimensions of Brexit. But if the same topic comes under Indian economy in GS paper 3, then you need to focus on the economic impact of Brexit on India and as well as on the global economy. Similarly, if a question comes on India and Pakistan under internal security, then the answer should focus on state-sponsored terrorism and cross-border terrorism. So through the course of your preparation, you need to understand these interlinkages which exist between different subjects. Now let us talk about the sources for international relations. For the static part, you can use any standard textbook such as the ones written by Rajiv Sikri, VP Dutt, etc. Because these books, they provide for a balanced understanding of India's foreign policy and they will help you to understand the core concepts of India's foreign policy doctrine. Along with that, these standard textbooks will also cover some of the major geopolitical developments since 1945. And one such textbook should be more than sufficient to cover the static part. Then coming to current affairs, one of the best sources would be the website and the social media handles of the Ministry of External Affairs. The MEA has a very active presence on all online platforms. So kindly follow them regularly for receiving updates on the foreign visits of the Indian Prime Minister and the Indian President. And you can also receive updates on the incoming visits of foreign leaders. But the most important source for international relations has to be your newspapers. You can read either the Hindu or the Indian Express, and you need to focus on the editorial page and as well as on the international page. Both the newspapers cover all the major international developments, but you need to be very consistent in reading newspapers and as well as in making notes. And when you come across any new development or a new region or a new concept, you need to do some basic online research and add those points to the notes that you are maintaining. And when we saw the mains questions, we discussed how almost every question is analytical in nature. It requires you to develop an analysis and provide your opinions. So in order to develop such critical thinking on foreign policy issues, you can refer to articles written by various think tanks such as the ORF or the Observer Research Foundation and as well as IDSA or the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Please follow their websites regularly because strategic experts, they frequently bring out various articles on foreign policy issues which will provide the required in-depth analysis. And for the same reason, you can also watch the Rajya Sabha TV and follow a couple of programs. This includes India's World and the Big Picture. And finally, please visit the official websites of regional and international organizations in order to make the notes that is required for the static part.